Hello, I'm the Analyst, and I'm here to talk about Hollywood's biggest box office flops. We recently saw the release of Spider-Man: Homecoming, marking the franchise's second reboot. How does a franchise have two reboots in under a decade? Simple. Have the prior entry be maligned by audiences as a result of Sony's belief that more villains equals more money. Let me explain. In 2002, Sony released the original Spider-Man, starring Tobey Maguire as the titular web-slinger, and was directed by Sam Raimi. The film was a critical success and would go on to set numerous records at the box office, becoming the first film to debut over $100 million in its opening weekend, ultimately making over $820 million worldwide on a production budget of $139 million. 2 years later, the duo would re-team for Spider-Man 2, which many not only considered to be better than the original, but one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, and would be the only entry to win an Academy Award, though it admittedly made less than the original, with just $783 million on a $200 million budget. Then came 2007's Spider-Man 3, where producer Avi Arad convinced Sam Raimi to shoehorn in fan-favorite villain Venom. The film got mixed to positive reviews from critics and mixed to negative fan reception, with Venom being singled out for criticism. Commercially, it made $890 million worldwide on a $258 million budget, making it the highest grossing entry worldwide, though the lowest grossing domestically. Director Sam Raimi was attached to make a fourth entry, but he dropped out when he felt he couldn't get the film finished in time, that time being May 6th, 2011, to the quality he wanted. As such, Sony decided just to scrap the fourth film and restart from scratch. However, by that point Disney had acquired Marvel, necessitating Sony to negotiate with Disney over the rights. Sony would ultimately keep the film rights and the film revenues, but Disney got the merchandising and the rights for animation, Spider-Man. Sony would reboot the franchise as The Amazing Spider-Man, directed by Mark Webb and featuring the Social Network star Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. How did it turn out? It got generally positive reviews, though not as good as the first two Spider-Man films, and would make just under $758 million worldwide on a $230 million budget, hampered by both fatigue from the previous Spider-Man films and competition from The Dark Knight Rises. And if you heard me at the beginning, we're talking about a flop today, and that would be The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Looking at its gross, it doesn't seem like a flop, with $709 million worldwide. But when you look at leaked Sony documents that reveal the film cost $460 million to produce and market, it's clear this was a major flop. So how did this film do Spider-Man so wrong? You know, I've already done over 20 Analyst videos and almost the exact same thing through them. I'd like to do something different on this one. So I'll instead be discussing the multitude of reasons it sucked rather than just the plot. Though admittedly, I will be talking about the plot in many of these details. Number 1. Paul Giamatti as the Rhino. Okay, it's normal in superhero films to feature characters in pre-costume parts, i.e. characters that aren't superheroes but still exist. This is usually more helpful with like minor characters or obscure ones, but this doesn't always work. This is one instance where it didn't work, as you could have literally made him an original character and had no legitimate impact on the plot. But why did they put him in? to make a Sinister Six film featuring Spider-Man's immense rogue gallery as part of a cinematic universe, one to rival Marvel's own cinematic universe. But we'll discuss that later. Anyway, he makes his first appearance stealing plutonium from an Oscorp truck. How stupid would a multi-billion-dollar corporation have to be to carry plutonium on trucks in a crowded city? Giamatti is hammy and borderline enjoyable, but his character is useless in the grand scope of the film. Bookends him with him in a giant rhino robot suit, with the film ending during the final fight between him and Spider-Man, but we'll be saving the ending for later on in the video. Number 2. Peter and Gwen's relationship. Admittedly, the chemistry between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy is the best part of the film, as the two have a spark between them. It's just sad there's nothing around it. The big issue with their relationship, other than Captain Stacy having told Peter to keep Gwen out of this as he died, is that Gwen is applying for a position at Oxford that would ultimately make it next to impossible for the two to be together, and they subsequently have some squabbles about it. In the end, however, after venturing to the subway, Peter decides to go with Gwen to England, leaving New York unprotected from villains. About that, we'll discuss it later on. Or, alternatively, they could try to maintain a long-distance relationship and keep her out of harm's way. Number 3. Chris Cooper. Use him! The film cast Academy Award winner Chris Cooper as Spider-Man's chief enemy, Norman Osborn. And how does it use him? It leaves him bedridden in ugly makeup and almost in shadow, sprouting out exposition to his son Harry about some disease that he has and that it's genetic, before keeling over off screen. What a waste of a character! Did they only have him for one day? You could have had his drive to find a cure last longer in the film, so he wouldn't just die on his deathbed, and could have made him the central antagonist, as a proper Spider-Man film should, and would eventually twist the mind of Electro into working for him. Speaking of, that's our next point. Number 4. The handling of Electro. You're a nerd butt monkey who recently acquired dangerous abilities and is struggling to handle them. If you think like this movie, you become an evil supervillain on a whim! And that's exactly what happens. In this film, Max Dillon, played by Jamie Foxx, is a geeky, borderline obsessive Oscorp employee who happens to be saved by Spider-Man from a taxi during the Rhino's theft, and such begins to feel connected with Spider-Man as he saved him, and that somehow made him special, despite saving people being part of Spider-Man's job description. And how did he get his powers? Poor safety standards at Oscorp, as he fell into a pit of electric eels as he was doing some repairs above said pit under orders from Alistair Smith, his supervisor. He found he got these powers and inadvertently caused havoc around Times Square, naturally getting people frightened and the cops firing on him despite Spidey's attempts to calm him down. And who should his target be? The corporate scumbags that essentially killed him, or the innocents who had nothing to do with it? We're in a generic, badly made superhero film. You can guess what he does. Now, if the writers were smart, and there were a lot of writers, they would have made him more like Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man 2. A sympathetic villain who didn't want to be evil, but was warped and twisted that way. And in this instance, maybe the twisting would be done by the Osborns, so that he doesn't blame them for his condition, but rather our resident web-slinger. And throughout the film, he basically forgets that Oscorp made him like this, blaming Spider-Man and everyone else. and eventually teams up with Harry Osborn, though admittedly, Harry wasn't part of what happened to him. He later takes out all the power in New York. Hey, where'd he get that jumpsuit? Is his powers literally limitless? And in his final encounter with Spider-Man, plays a dubstep version of Itsy Bitsy Spider before being beaten and seemingly vanishing. Though he'll be back if the film got a continuation. Number 5. Magnetism. After his first encounter with Electro, Peter seeks a way to make his web shooters resistant to Electro's powers, as one of his web shooters was damaged. And how does he decide to learn about magnets? YouTube videos! YouTube is where people go to watch funny cat videos, lists, and unpopular critics reviewing box office failures. You don't use YouTube to learn about advanced magnetism. Peter should know this stuff already, or at the very least be looking at a college-level book about this concept, and that would give him a more suitable answer. And how does he eventually get his solution?
Did you try magnetizing them?
Just an example of how inept this film's writing is. Gwen's not a scientist. Peter is. And at no point did Peter figure this out. What an idiot! Number 6. Peter's investigation into his father. The film tries to have a story thread about Peter looking into what his father was up to before he died, showing that someone wanted him dead, as there was a fight on an airplane between Richard Parker and an assassin. Though there were much easier ways to kill the Parkers than shooting them. Despite Mr. Parker having no fighting experience whatsoever, he manages to fend off the assassin and backs up his files on a Sony laptop. A lot of Sony product placement in this film, before losing the laptop and eventually his life. During Peter's investigation, in which Aunt May reveals the FBI were investigating him, Peter finds subway tokens hidden in his calculator, because any reasonable man would hide his subway tokens inside the battery section of a calculator. Venturing to the subway, Peter finds a video of his father, where Mr. Parker sprouts more exposition about his genetics research at Oscorp that he sabotaged by putting his own blood inside of the spiders, meaning only his bloodline could utilize it. Sort of explaining how Peter got his spider powers. And what was the culmination of this look? Nothing. This had no impact on the plot whatsoever. Let's be generous and assume they had this as a sequel hook, but with such an important plot point, it deserves to have resolution in the very same movie it gets introduced in. Number 7. Harry Osborn. In this film, Harry is played by Dane DeHaan, who previously had an impressive turn as Alex in Chronicle, and sadly, he's given nothing to do. He just whines and sits around, wanting Spider-Man's blood to cure the disease that killed his father and was now slowly killing him. Though he's shown the signs a lot sooner than his father. Plot hole, people. And Harry throws a tantrum when Spider-Man refuses, thinking it'd be too dangerous. Okay, this one's to Spider-Man. Do you think Harry would be stupid enough to inject himself directly with your blood? Or maybe I should be questioning Harry. Are you stupid enough to inject yourself with Spider-Man's blood? Anyway, he tries to get information directly from Oscorp, only to be locked out of the loop by Donald Menken, played by Colm Farrell, who stages a corporate mutiny and kicks him out of his own company, knowing full well he will die. As a result, he enlists Electro to get even and forces Menken at gunpoint to inject him with the spider venom from Richard Parker's experiments. This results in him becoming the Green Goblin, driven insane by everything he's been through, and what happens next, I'll talk about later.
behavior of your neighbor, even when stability's never.
Number 8. Too many villains. If you haven't surmised it, one of the film's big issues is that it has too many villains. Electro, Green Goblin, Rhino, and Dr. Ravencroft. Plus, corrupt executive Donald Mencken. This was the exact same problem Spider-Man 3 suffered from, making it clear that Sony wasn't learning from its mistakes. They were too focused on getting this film to be a prequel to Sinister Six, the signs of which were unsubtle to say the least, and had that film scheduled for November 2016. But there were quite a few issues with this strategy. You can't make a spin-off film unless the original had enough of a fan base and goodwill to justify it. And the franchise didn't have enough of either, as this was only the second film. I know that the Minions had their own spin-off after 2 films, but they had far more popularity than any of these characters. Secondly, with its scheduled November 2016 release date, it would have come out 3 months after Suicide Squad beat it to the punch. Third, can there be a Spider-Man cinematic universe? In theory, I suppose it's possible, but you need a lot more characters for future films that aren't Spider-Man. And Marvel happens to have the rights to most of them. Speaking of, a good comparison to this film would be Iron Man 2, which is my least favorite MCU film. However, that film was only flawed in its tone. The integration into the Avengers and MCU as a whole was actually done well and fit organically into the story, unlike this film. And finally, number 9. The ending. You know what I said earlier about the ending? This film tries to recreate the most tragic moment in Spider-Man history, after the death of Uncle Ben, which, I remind you, is still unresolved. And it doesn't take. After beating Electro, Harry in the Proto-Goblin outfit attacks Peter, having surmised he was Spider-Man, as well as abducting Gwen. And in the battle, Gwen ends up falling down a clock tower, and Peter's attempts to catch her end up killing her because of the whiplash. In the comics, Gwen's death was a shocker because nobody saw it coming. Well, except those who read the cover, as that was put on the cover by comic authorities at the time. But here, since that event happened, almost everyone saw that coming. And not only that, there's no investment into her death. How could one of the main character's deaths not be poignant? Well, for one, it's glossed over in a montage that takes place over the course of several months. And after seeing Gwen's graduation speech, which Peter couldn't have taped because he was busy with the Rhino, he decides to return as Spider-Man to battle Rhino. And also having been inspired by some little kid dressed up as Spider-Man staring him down. You couldn't have made a worse ending if you tried. And there was a film that ended with a link to a website. A website link. A better way to handle this would be to have Gwen's death at the start of a 3rd film. And have it affect Peter by making him embrace his darker side, and it could have also opened the door to Spider-Gwen. That was The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst superhero movies ever made. The film has both too much and too little, with the whole thing being a cynical, manufactured attempt to make a cinematic universe, focusing more on the villains instead of the hero, and even then the villains are poorly developed. Sony banked too much on the brand name instead of trying to make a film of legitimate quality, and simply repeated the same mistakes that nearly cost them the brand in the first place. I mean, the filmmaking is decent for a mega blockbuster, and the 2 leads have solid chemistry, but the writing is a disaster with surprisingly unintelligent decisions made by the characters and a hole-filled plot. Stay far away from the cinematic garbage at all costs. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 merited mixed reviews from critics, and was the worst reviewed Spider-Man movie thus far, even worse than Spider-Man 3, so this film already had an uphill battle. When the film hit America, it opened on the first weekend of May, that date being May 2nd, which also happened to be the same weekend the first and third Spider-Man films opened too, whereas Spider-Man 2 and The Amazing Spider-Man each opened over the 4th of July weekend. It debuted in first place with 91.61 million, which was considerably lower than the other May opening Spider-Man films. And compared to its predecessor, it's an apples to oranges comparison, as that film debuted on a Tuesday, rendering comparisons next to impossible. However, it was safe to say that this wasn't an impressive debut, and garnering a B+ cinema score from audiences, it didn't have a whole lot more it could do. In its second weekend, it fell 61% to 35.5 million against Neighbors, and the following weekend, The Roar of Godzilla sent it down another 53%. The film would eventually squeak by the 200 million mark domestically, but it petered out at 202.85 million, closing after 108 days in theaters. Overseas, it fared better, as expected for a Marvel film in this day of age, with 506.1 mil. Doing a bit better than The Amazing Spider-Man, but less business than Spider-Man 3, which remains the franchise high overseas. It had the best foreign results in China, followed by the UK, South Korea, Japan, Mexico, Brazil, France, Russia, Germany, Australia, India, Italy, and the Philippines. Sony's second entry in their rebooted Spider-Man franchise made 708.98 million worldwide, which at the moment is the highest grossing flop I have found. After theaters take their cut of the gross, Sony would see back 276.49 million, which easily covers the expensive $200 million marketing push, but most of their budget would remain as red ink in the theatrical run. Remember how earlier in the video I said Disney got the merchandising rights? That proved to be an exceptional strategy, as since the film disappointed, Sony didn't have the merchandising revenue to bounce back, and Disney was now in prime position to renegotiate the rights. Kevin Feige, one of Marvel's heads, would go to then Sony head Amy Pascal and worked out a deal to benefit both companies. Marvel would gain creative control over all Spider-Man films, and therefore allow him to enter the Marvel Cinematic Universe, while Sony would finance and distribute, giving them the much-needed revenues and getting an iconic character back to his home. A deal we're all better off for. The estimated theatrical loss on this film is $183.5 million. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, press the like button, and follow me on Twitter at Tyler the Analyst.